Hey, this is Pastor Bunjee Garrett, and I want to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement. Now, I honestly don't even know where to start this morning because there's just so much happening in this clown world. We're currently watching what appears to be the possible meltdown of the global financial system. Meanwhile, our Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, she just sat on CBS News. She sat on the show Face the Nation, where she assured America that the Biden economy is in good shape. Never mind the facts. Don't be confused with what you see with your eyes. Just continue believing that the Biden economy is in good shape. What's even worse than this lie is there's a member of the Biden administration who's already gearing up for a restriction on our free speech there on social media and all of this, to protect democracy from a financial collapse. According to Representative Thomas Massey, it was just yesterday during a Zoom meeting when members of Congress, they met with the Fed and the Treasury and the FDIC, regarding the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. And according to Representative Massey, it was during that meeting when one Democrat senator that he doesn't name, but according to him, the senator asked if there was a program in place to censor free speech at this time on social media. And so, the old censor free speech in order to protect democracy is already underway because this is the way. The Biden administration has also spent the last 2 years withholding the security footage evidence, which was recorded at the U.S. Capitol during the events of January the 6th, 2021. And while I'm sure we're all aware of the vandals who smashed out windows and illegally entered the Capitol, listen, there's recently released security footage, which also shows us another side to the whole story. And this footage helps us to see that the official J6 narrative isn't as cut and dry as they've pretended it to be. Now, without debate, there were bad actors who needed to be arrested. At the same time, the footage also shows us that the majority of people who entered the Capitol building that day, they appeared to have been invited in after Capitol Police moved barricades and opened doors. And yet, despite these facts, the mainstream media continues to push the narrative that this was the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. Well, thankfully, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, just informed us that he's preparing to release all of the contents of the January 6th security footage. He's going to release it to the public. And so we no longer have to trust Tucker. We're going to be able to look at and examine the evidence for ourselves. And while every American should celebrate this step towards political transparency, the Democrats aren't so happy. The Democrats in the House are criticizing McCarthy because, according to them, this level of transparency is somehow a threat to our democracy. Whatever happened to the belief that democracy dies in darkness? Sadly, this has been the same approach that the Biden administration has repeatedly taken with the COVID narrative. And while we know now that Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins both suppressed the information regarding the actual origins of the COVID virus, Fauci continues to distort the facts as he attempts to protect his own neck. That's right. It was just this past Saturday when Fauci attempted to downplay the whole lab leak theory by declaring this, and I quote him, "A lab leak could be that someone was out in the wild, maybe looking for different types of viruses in bats, got infected, went into a lab, and was being studied in a lab, and then came out of the lab. But if that's the definition of a lab leak, then that's still a natural occurrence." That's right. This is now Fauci's working theory. This is his working theory on how COVID-19 could have been a natural occurrence that also is a leak from a lab. I want to remind you, this is the guy who back in 2021, he informed us that those who criticized him were effectively criticizing the science. And here's how he put it, and I quote, "It's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous." That's right. Fauci wanted us to believe that he represents the science. And now that the truth is finally coming to light, he's still trying to spin the natural occurrence story. If I had to guess why, well, it's probably because Anthony Fauci could be indicted on multiple accounts of negligent homicide and involuntary manslaughter. The reason for this is based on the evidence that Fauci used American tax dollars to fund EcoHealth Alliance, who then used that money to subvert our laws against gain-of-function research. And they did this by offshoring their coronavirus research to the Wuhan lab there in China. And then in 2019, a novel bat coronavirus escaped from the same lab, resulting in the death of more than 1 million Americans. Sadly, Dr. I Am the Science He immediately began running cover by insisting that the virus occurred in nature and not in a lab. And the mainstream media, well, they've run with the propaganda as they've encouraged us to simply trust the science and to trust Dr. Fauci. Meanwhile, big tech silenced the voices of the experts who are out there challenging the official narrative by insisting that this has the evidence of being created in a lab. Unfortunately for Fauci, the DOE, the FBI, and the former CDC director Robert Redfield have all confirmed the lab leak theory is the most likely of story, and so Fauci is scrambling as he attempts to avoid the inevitable investigation and possible prosecution. It was last Friday when our House of Representatives passed a bill which is called the COVID-19 Origin Act of 2023. This bill could require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify information on the origins of COVID. And while the Senate passed the measure by unanimous consent on March the 1st, it was just last Friday, March the 10th, when the House unanimously voted in favor of this bill. I guess we'll wait to see if Biden is going to approve this transparency or if he's going to continue to protect democracy by vetoing this bill. Meanwhile, there is a petition to investigate and prosecute Anthony Fauci for apparent perjury to Congress because he lied in front of Congress, according to those who are attempting to prosecute him. And not only that, but there are also those who are preparing to charge Fauci with first-degree murder. And speaking of murderers, we must not fail to recognize Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda recently suggested that murder might be the right measure for dealing with the pro-lifers who want to stop mothers from murdering their babies. It was last Friday on The View when Jane Fonda insisted, and I quote her, "We have experienced many decades of having agency over our body, of being able to determine when and how many children to have. We know what that feels like. We know what that's done for our lives. We're not going back. I don't care what the laws are. We're not going back." So Jane Fonda was defending the so-called right for women to terminate the lives of their preborn babies. And so Joy Behar then asked, besides marching and protesting, what else do you suggest? And in response, Fonda replied, murder. That's what she said. Jane Fonda apparently believes that progressives have the right to murder pro-lifers if we won't allow them to murder their preborn babies. And while Behar tried to run cover by insisting that she's just kidding, Jane Fonda flashed her crazy eyes at the camera as she refused to recant her statement there on the show. Now, to be fair to Fonda here, she did end up releasing a statement addressing the incident, which reads, and I quote her, "While women's reproductive rights are a very serious issue and extremely important to me, my comment on The View was obviously made in jest." Obviously made in jest. Well, listen, it's not so obvious to everyone, and the reason I say this is because Jane Fonda was arguing for the right to murder unborn babies, and so because this is her position that it's a right to murder unborn babies, it's not hard for me to imagine that she also believes in a right to murder pro-lifers as well. In my opinion, Fonda was simply, saying the silent part out loud. I think that she was just saying the silent part out loud. And to prove my point, I would direct your attention back to a statement that she made in November of 2020 when Jane Fonda insisted that the coronavirus is a gift of God. That's what she said. She said it was God's gift to the left. And then she laughed with some evil laugh. That's right, the activist and actress known as Jane Fonda, who jokingly called for the murder of pro-lifers, she also believed that COVID-19 was God's gift to the progressive left. And as we consider the mentality of this leftist who doesn't seem to have a problem saying the silent part out loud, we must not fail to realize that the very people who assure us that they're trying to protect our democracy by covering up information, they're simultaneously bringing us to the brink of destruction, and all the while assuring us that this is what it takes to establish their leftist utopia. Listen, this is the same group that assures us that surgery is the best way to resolve gender dysphoria. They want us to believe that open borders are the best way to protect our nation against, the white supremacist terrorists who are trying to overthrow our government. And listen, it's sad to say that at least half of our nation has embraced this leftist agenda, which is leading us to the brink of destruction. Please trust me when I tell you that the agenda of the progressive left will not bring about a utopia. No, it will result in the economic collapse of our country as we're led like lambs to the slaughter. And knowing that this train is about to derail, I encourage you to take courage in the Lord. And I remind you of what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, where he declares, watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong, let all that you do be done with love. Listen, rather than allowing our anxieties to control us and rather than allowing our fears to drive us, let's stand fast in the faith as we continue to trust in Jesus Christ. And as we walk by faith with our Savior, He will help us to be brave, and He will help us to be strong, and He will help us to fight the good fight of faith, and all for the glory of God.